Well, good morning and welcome to today's Drought Hour. My name is Connie Strunk and I'm a plant pathology field specialist and I'll be your host and moderator today. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A session and we'll address them as they come up throughout today's presentation. I have the honor to introduce our first speaker. It is Laura Edwards, and she's our state climatologist for SDSU Extension. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
All right, thanks, Connie. And good morning, everyone who's been on the call here today, on the webinar today. I did present about a month ago, and so here we are with a May update on our climate for this growing season. So looking at what we've seen just recently, really in the last month or so, and kind of an update of what we see going forward. And the picture on the right might not look like a drought picture, but that was in Sioux Falls a couple of weekends ago when I was down there. Just some cool looking clouds, those kind of lumps showing some waves in the atmosphere. But really, it's another beautiful day in Sioux Falls in that picture where they have had less than half of the rain in a typical May. They've had just over an inch of rain in May. About 1.7 inches less than average for the month so far. So every dry day is another day of the drought, maybe is one way to say it. I've heard said sometimes. So looking at the last month, last 30 days, this is temperature side. I'll show precipitation in a bit. Departure or how different we have been from average temperature for the last 30 days. More or less near average. Remember, we were really cool for a while and then we got really warm more recently. So we're kind of balancing it out. We're kind of in the middle for a lot of us. So that's that yellow, light green area is right near average, just above or below average. The oranges, slightly warmer. And we get into the darker greens and blues, slightly cooler just over the last 30 days. So I know that's really slowed down a lot of our agriculture crop progress, really slowed down plant emergence, really slowed down weeds, slowed down insects, and it's also been dry. So we haven't had a huge demand yet from warm temperatures on our water resources and soil moisture, but we've seen some of that warmth recently. So when it's cool like this, typically we don't see too much change in the drought situation, even if we have dry conditions, but we still could use the moisture a lot of the state. Looking at precipitation, I'll show two different maps here. This first one is the total precipitation. How many inches of rain have we seen in the last 30 days? And you see the scale there at the bottom. Certainly recently here, last 30 days, the driest areas have been in the Northeast, Day, Roberts, Grant County up that way. But still that east central part, Hand, Hyde, Beetle County, around that area too, has been pretty dry. Just recently, there's been a couple big events that you see up in Perkins and northern Ziebach County in the purple area, purple dots rather, that have been very isolated, basically single event type of thing that really hasn't been consistent rain, but they've had a couple big events that pushed them up above average, or up a little bit wetter, I should say. But so this is precipitation total. How does that compare to what we typically expect for this time of year? And this is what that looks like. You see a lot of reds and maroons. So even if it looks like there's been a lot of rain compared to average, not so much. Less than 50%, less than 25% in the darkest maroon color for a lot of the areas of the state. And I know we're taking a closer look again on the eastern side of the state. We're ending April, things look decently good. These last 3 weeks in May here have really turned dry again for a lot of folks in the far east. Black Hills there too, another kind of red hot spot, also kind of holding steady at least. I know they've gotten some rain just recently. So this does not count anything that fell yesterday. That got reported this morning. And one resource that I use to look at this is COCORA's, our volunteer precipitation network. And people report rainfall or snowfall each day, hopefully in the morning, so it shows up on the map. We see a couple red dots up here in Perkins County. I think this further south one might be a typo there, it might be a little overreported, but this red one up here in the central part of Perkins County maybe is closer to right. I think that was 2.6 or so, something like that. So really good news. They got a little bit of rain there in the extreme drought area, and also out in the Black Hills, Rapid City area. Rest of the state, though, didn't add a whole lot to their May totals. All the blues here are roughly less than an inch or so. And I know up here in Brown County, where I'm at, just about a few hundredths, even though those thunderstorms came through last night. So it didn't add a whole lot there. And looking at soil moisture, we look at soil moisture still in its early growing season in the spring season, because again, that's our bank account, our reservoir, kind of our backup plan for when things turn really hot and dry, which it almost does almost every year at some point, but certainly we're more concerned about that this year, given how dry we are already. We don't have a lot to draw from in some areas of the state. So this is looking at percentile compared to this time of year. And so you see a lot of yellows and oranges kind of around the edges of the state, not so much the south central, but kind of around the edges of the state. They've kind of been ebbing and flowing here week to week as we get rain or get heat and dry conditions. So we're keeping an eye on that as well. Just looking at kind of a snapshot of soil moisture, it doesn't tell us how we rank, but looking at the South Dakota Mesonet, looking at, just how much moisture is available. We see, things kind of drying out. We're seeing more of those yellow colors at the shallow layers. If you remember, this is our poker chip map. Each chip in the stack represents a sensor at different depths. So when we're starting to turn yellow on those shallow layers, that's kind of an early warning sign that we're turning dry at that 2 to 4 inch layer in the soil. Looks like we do still have moisture at that lower depths, but at least on the row crop side, still those roots are pretty shallow, and they could use that shallow soil moisture. And looking at the drought monitor, I know this has been a hot topic lately, and we see quite a bit of severe extreme drought up in our Northern Plains area. And just last week, if you look up in North Dakota, they have a new area of D4, exceptional drought. To get to D4 category, that's very significant impacts and data showing maybe once or twice per 100-year kind of severe drought. So really, really rare. For us to even have D3, that's maybe 3 times in a century, something like that. So D3 is really, as they say here, extreme drought. That's really still quite significant. Just take a closer look at South Dakota. Currently, we have about 73% of the state in some level of drought. That's D1 or worse here on the drought monitor. If you recall, this is updated every week on Thursday morning, so it can change week to week. Currently, we have about 21% of the state in that red D3 color, and then another 18% or so in the D2 level drought. And I know that might be important for Jamie's talk that's going to follow me here in a little bit. We do have that white area of no dryness, no drought area right now in the east central area. But as I showed earlier at the beginning, we are keeping an eye on that as it's kind of been trending dry lately. And we're starting to hear a few more reports from the field of conditions drying out there, herbicides maybe not being as effective in this dry early season on the pre-emerge herbicides and so on. So I know there are starting to be a couple of issues or impacts kind of drought related out in that eastern side of the state. Looking at how the drought monitor has changed over the last month since our last webinar, since the last time I visited with you anyway, areas in yellow had a 1 category or 1 class degradation towards worse. The light green colors had 1 class improvement. So you can kind of see it's really been kind of some small tweaks over the last month, but no really big or multi-category changes over the last month. And again, I think that's been tied more to the cooler temperatures that have kind of held back any real big impacts from emerging just yet, although it still has been dry for most of the state up until just very recently. Sharing a picture here on the ag side, looking at pasture and range conditions. And so this is looking at the last 20 years, 2001 through this year. If you look on the far left, you'll see there's only been 3 weeks of reporting in the USDA NASS report, National Ag Statistics Service report. And that's this bright red color here. So right now, as of last week, we don't have the report yet today. As of last week, we're in the second worst rating as far as pasture and range condition in the last 20 years. The one year that's worse, I believe, this is 2013, below us, but this time in 2013, things turned really wet, and especially in the western part of the state, which ended up having a near like a record wet year that year. So that's a very different situation. The purple color here is 2004, I believe. So we're kind of, that's another year that started off pretty tough. If you remember, the 2002 to 2006 years were kind of a string of drought years back to back there. And you can see the handful of years. The year that ended the worst in the last 20-year period here is 2012, and that's this orange line that dips way down here in this September-October period. So just to kind of give you some comparisons of some other years that may have been similar to this at some point. So we'll be keeping an eye on this. Certainly, we've already lost some ground, and if you guys have been following the webinars, Jesselyn Batchelor last week talked about this a little bit. You know, we've already missed a lot of precipitation opportunity in April and early May. It's really important, you know, really critical that we get some rain going forward. But already, I think some of those impacts have already locked in, and for some of our pasture range areas, you know, our maximum yield is probably already capped up at something below average for this time for the season already. Just looking at the forecast now, starting with kind of the near term, the next week, and looking out the month and 3-month periods, looks a little optimistic again this week for multiple rain event opportunities. Already looking ahead towards the middle of the week, Wednesday-ish, in the south and east. Very high probability already of some rain event coming through much of the state on Wednesday into Thursday. And then some more chances over the weekend. And I know it's a holiday weekend, and people like to be out and about, but does look like several chances, although we did see this last week and not everything panned out. When we're looking at this map here, total rain in the next 7 days, the purple areas look like 1.5 inches or more. The blue colors are 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. So still can be quite variable from day to day. So again, we'll see how this pans out in the next several days. Also, I should say, I didn't say anything about temperatures here, but we're starting off warm here this week for the next day or so. But as we see that big front pass through on Wednesday, temperatures will take a dip, and we'll see highs in the 60s in the east for some of us. Typical highs are in the low 70s for this time of year. So we'll see a dip towards some cooler temperatures again, but it looks like we'll rebound here right in the first week of June. On the left there is a temperature probabilities for that May 31st to June 6th time period. Much of the northern, say half and west part of the state, slightly favored to be warmer than average, maybe near to average on the south, but also leaning towards dry there on the right. That's the beige color. So looks like we're going to see some ups and downs. Not unusual for this time of year for May to see some more rainy activity interspersed with some dry periods in between, kind of going up and down from cooler and warmer back and forth. So yeah, it's kind of a typical May pattern is what we see here. As we look towards June overall, still holding on to above average temperatures, more likely across our area in the northern states here. And this has been pretty consistent in a lot of the recent model runs and in the last few months even, not just very recently. So I think there's fair confidence, at least pretty good confidence of above average temperatures in June overall. On the right there, precipitation in the western half of the state, still leaning towards below average, more likely here. And so that's not great news. Warm plus dry are not the right ingredients that we want to see in June. We'd rather see some more moisture, maybe some cooler temperatures. So keep that in your plans. I know people are working on their drought plans, especially if you're in the livestock, pasture, grass kind of part of agriculture. And it's time to start thinking about, if not taking action already, on what are your steps, what are your trigger points, how much rain do you need, and what dates are important to you to start making some of those decisions in the coming weeks. Looking out further ahead, June, July, and August, so this is taking all three of those months put together here. You still see that continued odds leaning towards warmer than average in the Dakotas and our neighboring areas to our west and south. Similarly, the precipitation pattern still more likely dry. I think they're a little conservative on that darker brown, that's 40 percentile line. I think it's even, I have even a little more confidence that the far western side of South Dakota might be dry. So they may have played a little safe there. Again, though, you can see some very local storms that could dump some rain here and not there. So summertime precipitation is, notoriously challenging, but hopefully we catch a few rains, but the warmer than average temperatures, I think, are going to be a challenge to overcome. And as a result, kind of pulling all those pieces together, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center did also issue the seasonal drought outlook, and this is looking at now basically through the end of August, and that area shaded in yellow, they do favor some more drought development, and that's a lot of the south and filling in the western side of the state. Again, that's looking at the ingredients of temperature and precipitation, plus where we sit right now for soil moisture and so on. So there's multiple factors going in here. I neglected to put in my slideshow here today some information from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but they did come out with their runoff forecast also a couple weeks ago in May for the rest of the year, and they are continuing to lower their predicted runoff in the Missouri River. What that means, and they're now giving a heads up, as if you have water intakes in the main stem Missouri River, they may go dry or have some issues with drought this year. And that's different than what we saw in 2017, where there was ample water in the Missouri River. This year, not so much. So if you're relying on Missouri River water either for irrigation or other water supply needs, the Missouri River itself is also running dry, given, the dry conditions up in Montana and North Dakota they've experienced right along with us. So that is a concern also going forward, I think, for the agriculture community and communities and water supply. Those are some highlights for now. Here's my contact information, and feel free to reach out also on social media if you like to. And Connie, I'm happy to take questions if there's anything in the Q&A or chat. Thank you for listening today.
I don't see any Q&A questions at this point in time. So we have a few moments. If anybody has a question for Laura or a comment that you'd like to make, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A or chat. If you're here with us, I am going to load the QR code for those that need it for the CCA CEU credits. So I'm going to do that briefly.
Just while we have a moment, Connie, just a little addition. I know we saw some severe weather yesterday, at least one tornado that I saw a picture of. But overall, it's been very, very quiet severe weather-wise. That's only the second or third tornado of the whole season so far for South Dakota. So it's been really, really quiet, and that's true really across the whole country. So if anything, there's a blessing in disguise about this year. I think it's the lack of severe weather so far that we've seen.
Well, thank you, Laura. And if as the presentation goes on today, if you have questions for Laura, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A or in the chat feature. But at this time, I'm going to welcome Jamie to go ahead and start sharing her slides. And I'll introduce you to Jamie White with FSA, who is going to cover the government drought programs.
Okay, well, thank you, Connie. I just want to be sure that you can see my slides before we get started.
I don't see anything yet.
Are you good now?
No.
It's not showing it. Hold. Well, hang tight here. I apologize for that. Are you seeing anything yet?
Yes, we do.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to SDSU for allowing the Farm Service Agency to go ahead and participate in the session today. And this is a nice compliment, I guess, for FSA to be able to talk about the suite of disaster assistance, or more specifically, drought assistance programs that are available to farmers and ranchers throughout the nation as a result of drought and or other disaster conditions. Now, Laura's presentation was very much more on the planning and proactive front, and FSA, we're going to talk more about, again, the support and the response front. And I do have a slideshow, and I'm certainly not going to read through everything, but at least this will allow us to address the high points as it relates to FSA's suite of drought assistance programs. Probably first and foremost, I think the pertinent program to discuss is the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, which is not a new program that FSA administers. Obviously, it has become relatively new for FSA to have a suite of permanent disaster programs that are in place and are not being passed on an ad hoc basis by Congress when there are disaster conditions. But the Livestock Forage Disaster Program is intended to design assistance to livestock producers, and to be considered a livestock producer, we always say they have to have their hat in hand, they have to have livestock, and they have to have risk in the actual grazing acres or hayland specifically. LFP, as we refer to the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, applies in the instance we have a qualifying drought, which is based on the US Drought Monitor, again, which is why this is a great nexus for this discussion today, or qualifying fire on federally managed rangeland. Now, LFP is only going to be applicable, and I'll speak to South Dakota specifically, when there are grazing losses that occur during the grazing period in South Dakota. And our grazing period has changed in the last couple of years, and the grazing period is currently only May 1st through October 15th. So that's when we're looking at the drought monitor specifically. There is an application that does need to be filed for LFP eligibility. It's not an automatic payment. So if we have a farmer or rancher who does suffer losses due to drought, they do need to contact their local FSA office to submit the 853. And this does need to be submitted no later than 30 calendar days after the end of the calendar year in which the grazing loss occurred. So we know the grazing period ends October 15th. We're looking at, for 2021, these applications would need to be submitted no later than January 30th of 2022. So there is a time period in which those applications can be filed. When we're looking at grazing losses due to drought, this does apply, obviously, again, if the farmer or rancher does have livestock and they have to have ground that would be considered native or improved pasture land with permanent vegetative cover, or that can include ground that is reported to FSA as crops planted specifically for grazing for those eligible livestock, which could include your small grains or forage sorghum. Grazing losses for covered livestock must occur on land that is physically located in a county that is during that normal grazing period. So we're talking May 1st to October 15th again, in a county that is rated by the US Drought Monitor as having any of the following, and we'll break this down into the actual drought intensity. So if we're looking at D2, which would be severe drought, to be eligible for a payment, there needs to be at least 8 consecutive weeks where that physical location county is identified as having severe drought. So in South Dakota, if our grazing period starts on May 1st, we're not going to have any eligibility for LFP at the D2 severe drought level until July 1st. D3 extreme drought, which we do have in South Dakota, it impacts 12 counties currently. Essentially, once we have any one day that triggers in D3, there's a payment that triggers. In D4, and Laura referred to this earlier, not something we see very frequently, but D4 also does trigger a specific drought intensity payment. So what we're looking at on this slide, and it references it to a drought intensity payment factor. So that D2 severe drought for 8 consecutive weeks, that's going to trigger a 1-month payment. D3 extreme drought, the minute we hit D3 in a given county for 1 day, that's going to trigger a 3-month payment. If we have 4 non-consecutive weeks at the D3 extreme drought level, that will trigger a 4-month payment. And we do have 12 counties in South Dakota that we're anxiously watching and awaiting to see what the drought monitor triggers this week, because those 12 counties could potentially be eligible for a 4-month payment, depending on how that looks yet this week. D4, the minute we hit that for 1 day, That will trigger a 4-month payment, and 4 non-consecutive weeks at the D4 drought level would trigger a 5-month payment. So as we've been talking about this, obviously we do have 12 counties in South Dakota today that are eligible for the livestock forage program. And right now it's a 3-month payment based on that D3 trigger for at least 1 day. So we're looking at the northwestern and north central part of the state where we have counties that are eligible. And again, it does require an application. It's not going to automatically trigger a payment until the participant does file an application with the Farm Service Agency. Again, you must have eligible livestock to be eligible for LFP. So you can't just own land. You can't just have pasture land. FSA on the application, not only are we looking at the acres reported for grazing, we're also looking at the number of livestock that the producer does run. So to be eligible livestock, they must be grazing animals, weaned adult and non-adult beef cattle. That would include beefalo, buffalo, bison, dairy cattle, alpacas, deer, elk, emus, equine, goats, llamas, reindeer, sheep. So there's a whole suite of animals, but again, they must be considered to be grazing animals. They must be livestock that would normally have been grazing during that eligible grazing land or pasture land in the eligible county. During the normal grazing period for the specific type of grazing land or pasture land for the eligible county during the qualifying drought. So they would have to be grazing during that time period, or when the federal agency prohibited the eligible livestock producer from using managed rangeland or grazing due to a qualifying fire. So we do experience that in South Dakota. We have many federally managed lands where we do have a federal agency that does restrict access if there are wildfires or even potentially due to drought. Again, we always refer to under the LFP program, they must be eligible livestock. So there are livestock that are not eligible. We do experience this here in South Dakota as well. And those ineligible livestock would be livestock that are raised for consumption by owner, hunting, pets, pleasure, roping, or show. So they are not considered to be eligible livestock for LFP purposes. To ensure eligibility requirements have been met, again, we are requiring that that producer provides evidence to support that they are an active producer and that they do have a risk in the land that is subject to the drought. So we do need to have a copy of the written acreage lease or rental agreement. Again, if that land is subleased, then the original lease and sublease must be provided. In South Dakota, we have the federally managed lands, we have BIA, BLM, oversight where there are grazing permits issued, so we would need copies of that. And again, if there is a sublease associated with that federally managed land, we would need to have a copy of that valid approved sublease. To ensure that the eligibility requirements have been met, again, we're looking at signed copies of a grazing permit and or lease, final bill or invoice, and those things are only needed if we can't determine the risk, as well as the state land lease and or state land sublease. So these are things that are routinely provided to FSA, not only for the livestock forage program, but other FSA programs as well. And again, if we have a valid approved sublease, that's acceptable for LFP eligibility, but if it is not approved, then that sublessee would not be eligible for the livestock forage program. If there is not a written acreage lease on the ground in question, and this is not uncommon in South Dakota, and we see it in certain areas of the state more than others, we do have a form called the CCC 855 that can be completed to document that lease, and that must meet county committee review and determination as far as being eligible. And if the county committee does feel that the certification that is provided on the 855 is acceptable, then it would be documented and considered eligible under the livestock forage program. Again, when we're looking at the 855, this is an annual form and it's only acceptable for one applicable program year. We're going to look at that annually. It needs to obviously identify who the lessor and the lessee is, and it must be signed by both parties. In addition to filing an application for the livestock forage program, providing that lease justification or the 855 if there's not a written lease, to be eligible for the livestock forage program, and before you can even apply and receive a payment, a producer must file their annual report of acreage with the Farm Service Agency. So as we approach the grazing season in South Dakota this year, May 1st, obviously we knew drought was evident. We had a lot of individuals that were already asking about livestock forage program payment eligibility. And the minute we hit D3, that triggered that 3-month payment, FSA could not issue a payment until that producer completed their annual report of acreage. Western South Dakota, it's not uncommon for producers to file acreage reports in the months of March and April, but in Eastern South Dakota, we see it more commonly that May, June, and July are the big acreage reporting months. So again, before we can process an application for payment under LFP, we would need an acreage report on file by the participants. So again, that's a condition of not only eligibility, but that would be required as well to issue that payment. I just briefly want to dovetail into the emergency assistance for livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish program, what we refer to as the ELAP program. LFP really focuses obviously on the drought assistance, but the reason why I want to talk about ELAP is there is drought assistance as it pertains for water hauling, things of that nature that were impacted by in drought, but it also provides some assistance for I guess, adverse effects due to spring and summer storms, lightning fires, wildfires, that sort of thing. So those are things that we also experience specifically when we have cover on the ground that can serve as fuel to fire. But ELAP does provide emergency assistance to eligible producers of livestock, honeybees, and farm-raised fish. For today's discussion, we're focusing on livestock. The losses covered by ELAP do include livestock feed and grazing losses, water transporting costs due to drought. So this is something that we actually do see more frequently in Western South Dakota, as well as additional costs associated with gathering livestock and inspection related to cattle tick fever. So ELAP is probably not as cut and dry and simple to administer as that of LFP. But when we're looking at ELAP, the eligible livestock may include grazing animals. And again, we're looking at livestock that would have normally been grazing during the eligible grazing period on the grazing land or pasture land, must be owned, cash lease, purchased under contract, or been raised by a contract grower during the 60 calendar days prior to the date of the eligible adverse weather event, and they must be livestock maintained for commercial use. To be an eligible producer, and we have some timeframes that are a little bit different under ELAP here, but during the 60 calendar days before the beginning date of the eligible adverse weather, they must have been owned, cash lease, purchased, or entered into a contract, or it must be planted to a crop specifically for the purpose of providing grazing for covered livestock, or provided pasture land or grazing land during the normal grazing period to eligible livestock, as well as, that could include cash lease pasture land or grazing land for livestock that is physically located in the county where the eligible adverse weather loss condition occurred. So ultimately what we're looking at is, to be eligible, they must have demonstrated that they've had this risk for at least 60 days prior to the onset of the eligible disaster condition. ELAP covers many different disaster perils. Obviously, for the purpose of today's discussion, we're not looking at the winter storms, but in spring and summer, flood, lightning, tornado, or wildfire on non-federal land. Essentially, ELAP is intended to be that backup program to the livestock forage program to cover perils related to drought and lightning fire that would not be covered under the livestock forage program. So it would be fair to say they're not intended to be a double dip program, that you can get paid for the same loss or compensated for the same loss under LFP and then pick up coverage under ELAP, but it's covering up those additional losses that would not have been covered under the livestock forage program. To be eligible for grazing losses, and this just is going to be that specific example of where LFP does not pick up coverage, but eligible grazing losses must be incurred on eligible grazing lands physically located in the county where the eligible adverse weather loss condition occurred, or because of that eligible adverse weather event or loss condition. So the losses that we're looking at under ELAP could include purchased forage or feedstuffs, of mechanically harvested forage or feedstuffs resulting from additional costs incurred for transporting feed to eligible livestock, and resulting from the additional cost of purchasing additional feed above normal quantities required to maintain eligible livestock during an eligible adverse weather loss condition until additional livestock feed becomes available. Oftentimes where we see this become applicable is in the case of extreme flooding. So maybe there was feed available and we had extreme flood that came in and washed that feed stuff out. An additional purchase of feed was necessary to sustain the livestock operation. Grazing loss payments would include the feed costs for all covered livestock owned by the eligible livestock producer based on the number of grazing days lost, not to exceed 150 days of daily feed costs for all covered livestock. Grazing loss for eligible livestock based on the normal carrying capacity of the eligible grazing land of the eligible livestock producer for the number of grazing days lost, not to exceed 150 days of lost grazing. So we do have a 150-day hold down. Livestock feed payments include livestock feed, again, that was purchased or mechanically harvested forage or feedstuffs that was intended for use as feed, but it must have been physically damaged or destroyed due to an eligible adverse weather event under ELAP. Additional costs for transporting livestock feed to eligible livestock, as well as additional costs of purchasing livestock feed above normal to maintain that livestock until additional livestock feed becomes available. One of the things that we have to look at when we're looking at livestock feed payments is the producer has the burden of proof or the responsibility to bring in their average normal cost for prior years to demonstrate that there was a burden above and beyond to support livestock feed needs as a result of the disaster peril. So we have to be able to compare the two. There is a national payment factor that applies to the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, and that's looked at on an annual basis based on the number of ELAP applications filed nationwide. So South Dakota, livestock may be a big factor. Yes, we have honeybees, but there are other states where there are other, not only perils, but livestock and covered eligibilities that we must compete with at a national level to make ELAP payments. So there is always a national payment factor that could come into play to ensure that there's adequate funding for all eligible and approved applications nationwide. But there is a national payment factor that does apply to historically underserved producers that would be considered disadvantaged, limited resource, or a beginning farmer, a rancher, or a veteran, and they will receive 90% of the payment rate for livestock losses under ELAP. So there is a special payment rate for those groups. Again, to apply for ELAP, no different than any other FSA program, you have to contact your local county office, but ELAP, much like LFP, it must be filed within 30 calendar days of the end of the calendar year for which benefits are requested. So we're looking at January 30th, 2022 for ELAP, just like LFP. For livestock losses, it's important that that notice of loss be filed with FSA within 30 calendar days of when that loss is apparent. Very briefly, I just want to touch on the non-insured crop disaster assistance program, and NAP is a program that FSA has been administering for multiple years. And the reason why I'd like to just touch base on NAP is we talk about LFP and ELAP being complementary programs. So you're not being paid double benefits for the same loss under LFP and ELAP. NAP, conversely, is an insurance program or offers risk protection. So you could be paid on the same acres for the same loss due to the same peril under NAP as you could be, compensated under the livestock forage program. So NAP is a voluntary assistance program as well. It's risk protection, so it does require that the producer participate in advance, much like crop insurance. And again, it's intended to provide risk protection due to natural perils. So drought would be included in that, excessive moisture, wind, hail, wildfire, things of that nature. It can also include insect infestation. So in South Dakota, we have specific sales closing dates for NAP, much like multi-peril crop insurance. All fall seeded crops, the sales closing date is September 30th to purchase the NAP application for coverage. Spring seeded crops and grasses, March 15th is the annual sales closing date. Once you participate in NAP, yes, there's an annual fee, but there's a continuous coverage capability that it can roll from year to year with minimal intervention of the producer. I apologize, I flipped too early. With the NAP program, again, it does require producer engagement and interaction with FSA. So if there is a loss that occurs, the producer must file a notice of loss with the Farm Service Agency by the earlier of 15 calendar days after the disaster occurrence or the loss became apparent, or 15 calendar days after the end of the coverage period. So for grazing acres, we know the grazing period is May 1st through October 15th. The latest you can file a notice of loss on grazed acres due to drought, for instance, would be 15 calendar days beyond that October 15th ending date of the grazing period. Outside of that, it's considered late filed. Application for payment must be filed within 60 calendar days after the coverage period ends. So again, that coverage period ends for grazed acres on October 15th. So that application for payment would need to be filed no later than 45 days after that 15-day time frame for the notice of loss to be filed. NAP used to be cat level coverage only for multiple years, but now we have the option of buy-up coverage. So you can do your basic cat level coverage where loss triggers at 50%, the buy-up coverage all the way up to 65%, which allows for loss triggers at a rate of 35% or as low as 35%. Again, NAP cost depends on your choice of coverage. The standard fee for cat level coverage is $325 per crop. 3 crops or more is $825. So the max a producer would pay for cat level coverage is $825. Those fees are waived if the producer is considered to be a beginning or historically underserved farmer. Premium or buy-up options are available, but again, those are due February of the following year of insurance. So if we have 2021 as the insured year, which we're in today, that would be due the next February. This is just a brief life cycle of NAP. Obviously, the first step is to purchase coverage. Within that life cycle, obviously, we need to establish a yield if they're a new producer or not. They need to report planted acres annually. We always have to have a notice of loss. In many cases, we need to send out a loss adjuster to go through and perform the appraisal. We go through harvest. There's a final loss adjustment evaluation. We need that payment application filed again within 60 days of the end of the coverage period. And then after that point, once we have a complete application for payment on file, payment would be processed within 30 days. So in South Dakota, what I would say, it's not uncommon, especially if we're talking about this year, if we have NAP grazing losses due to drought. Typically, we start to see NAP grazing loss payments go out in December, January, and February, because we have to get through the end of the grazing period. We have to be able to assess losses, go through the committee review and approval of those applicable grazing loss establishments. And then that also allows for producers to get those applications for payment in timely. Very quickly to close out, I'm just going to talk about the conservation programs as they pertain to drought assistance. And conservation programs do have great applicability here in South Dakota. And first and foremost, I think one of the items that we frequently address questions on or requests for is emergency haying and grazing of CRP when we're in periods of drought. And I do have a quick flow chart here for reference. And obviously, the good the good news is there is no payment reduction if there's eligibility of emergency haying and grazing due to drought based on the drought monitor. In general, just as a rule of thumb, I know emergency haying is typically what people are interested in. Emergency haying is not going to be an approved eligible practice during the primary nesting season. So that's outside of our sphere of influence. Obviously, we're going to be looking at emergency haying as we move into the month of August. So right now, today, early as we are in the grazing season, and obviously we are within that primary nesting season, emergency grazing is definitely an option, and this can take place during the primary nesting season on all practices. If there's an agreement with a 50% reduction of normal carrying capacity, once that county is eligible for LFP payments, which would be D2 at 8 weeks. So if we don't have D2 at 8 weeks, and in South Dakota, we don't have any counties that have met D2 at 8 weeks, the earliest we can meet that is July 1. So D2 at 8 weeks, no matter what in South Dakota, July 1st is the earliest that we could allow that emergency grazing. But in those 12 counties where we've triggered LFP eligibility at D3, based on that one day, we do have emergency grazing available. So up to 90 days of grazing can be allowed. And to do this, for the producer to begin that activity, they need to contact the local FSA office. It must be an approved activity before that grazing commences. Typically, what we hear frequently, emergency grazing, not only is it a great option, and the wildlife groups and our conservation partners absolutely support that grazing activity. One of the challenges that we have are the fencing capabilities to promote that enhanced grazing of those approved CRP acres, which is oftentimes why the emergency haying is a more desirable or advantageous prospect for the participant. But again, as it is today, we have 12 counties in South Dakota that would meet that potential eligibility. I just briefly want to touch on the Emergency Conservation Program, which is ECP. Many of you might be familiar with the NRCS's EQIP program. ECP is very similar to EQIP, but ECP is triggered based on eligible disaster conditions and emergency response. But under Emergency Conservation Program, EC6 is an option available as a drought emergency measure, which provides water conservation and enhancement measures to provide or permit grazing of range, pasture, forage by livestock in the avenue of supplying emergency water for existing irrigation systems. And it also provides emergency water for confined livestock operations. This may include both temporary and/or permanent practices. Now, ECP, that is implemented on a county by county basis. The sign-up periods are different, and the causes of loss or the perils may be different as well. So in South Dakota, as it is today, I believe we have 10 ongoing ECP signups. 3 are for wildfires, and the remaining signups are for drought. So I believe it actually includes 9 counties. Perkins County, I believe, is doing both drought and wildfire, but they're very peril specific. Outside of that, just in general, for FSA information, I encourage you all to look at www.farmers.gov. That's the producer-based version of the FSA website. It's been newly unveiled over the last 18 months, and it does focus on programs that are pertinent right here and right now, nationwide, not necessarily state-specific. Outside of that, I'll turn it back to you, Connie, and if there's any questions I can field.
There was one comment in the chat, but I believe it might be addressed already. The question was, what documentation is needed if you own the property, if you do not lease?
For the livestock forage program, if you own the property and you do not lease the property, we should have that information on file at the FSA county office, because that would be set up in our FSA system of records. So we should be good to go based on that. If not, we could obtain a copy of that information from the Register of Deeds, working with the producer or the county courthouse.
Thank you. Are there any other chat or questions that a person may have that you would like to drop on that Q&A or within that chat feature? Between Laura and Jamie, they'd be happy to address any questions that you may have. Well,
Sorry, this is Laura. Just wanted to add about the U.S. Drought Monitor map that Jamie had mentioned too. So that map is produced one map per week. So she referenced to any day, of a county in whatever category. But really, it's really only produced 1 week. So any single map would potentially, make them eligible for whichever program. So you don't need to be checking it every day. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you for that clarification. I don't want to create any confusion on that front, Laura. And I will say, I'll put in the plug. I know this is something we often say. We have many farmers and ranchers that feel oftentimes the drought monitor isn't representative of the conditions in their area, et cetera. And this is a great opportunity for farmers and ranchers to get involved in and serve as a reporting station and look into CocoRa's. And every year I look at or we hear complaints or concerns from producers, but then I look at the number of reporting stations, and that's really within the sphere of influence of our farmers and ranchers. So again, I just would support that effort and initiative.
Yeah, it's a good point. Anyone who's a CocoRa's observer can report what we call a condition monitoring report, and that goes directly to the drought monitor authors. So, and I know that they share that internally in their group as one piece of the puzzle when they're drawing the lines. But I also put in the chat here for everybody the general drought impact report website, and that's at the University of Nebraska, also the same place that hosts the drought monitor website. So again, if you have any drought impact pictures, anything you want to share, that's a great place to fast track it right to the drought monitor authors.
Well, I think as people are thinking about any questions that they may have, I'll have Matt just launch the poll at this time. It's a very brief 2-question survey that will help the presenters and help us as we prepare other programming efforts. We'll go ahead and have Matt end that poll. Just thank you for those that have, attended today's presentation and webinar. If you have ideas or thoughts that you'd like to see us address, whether it's through articles or webinars or other programming means, please feel free to, drop any one of us a line on that. And all previous Drought Hour recordings or webinars are available on our SDSU YouTube channel. And again, just want to thank you for taking the time to attend our sessions. All right, any final questions for any of our presenters? If not, I just want to say thank you for tuning in to today's Drought Hour. And as we come up with other programming, we may see another series start up here in the month of June. But with that, I just want to say thank you and have a great rest of the week and month.